As I see it, tariffs. I've just watched President Trump's State of the Union address, in which he said many times that America had gained hundreds of millions of dollars from the tariffs he had imposed on Canada. This has left me confused. Was I missing something? So I decided to ask ChatGPT to put me straight. I first wrote down what I believed to be the way tariffs worked, and then asked ChatGPT to comment. So this is exactly what I told it. When Trump places a tariff on Canadian goods imported into the US, most, if not all, of this extra cost will be added to the price that the American importer will have to pay the US Treasury on receiving the goods and services. This increase will percolate along supply chains and will end up increasing the final price being paid by the end customers. The whole purpose of tariffs is to make the price so expensive that imports will stop, and so that subsequently equivalent goods and services can be produced locally at a lower price, denying any need for importation. But such alternatives will take time to come online, if it is at all possible. And in fact, this is impossible in the case of importing scarce heavy metals. Nevertheless, if the importation continues, but at a reduced scale, through to a final sale at the now higher price, then that will be a charge on American citizens, not Canadian. So when Trump brags that the tariffs have raised hundreds of millions of dollars, that money mostly comes from American pockets. As I see it, tariffs are not primarily about revenue. Rather, there are two main reasons to impose them. First, they are bargaining tools meant to intimidate, creating a potential loss of income to the exporter because of a marked decrease in sales, and this puts pressure on them during the negotiation of any trade deal. Secondly, it is a means of correcting so-called unfair trade practices like subsidized production, manipulated currency values, the theft of intellectual property, or the imposition of other barriers to trade, such as is the case of China's state-directed manufacturing. So I asked ChatGPT, have I got this right? ChatGPT replied that I was not missing anything fundamental. My understanding is largely consistent with how tariffs work economically. It then walked me carefully through the topic and clarified 6 further points. First point, who actually pays a tariff? It said when the US government imposes a 15% tariff on imports from Canada, as is happening under Trump's administration, the tariff is legally paid by the US importer to the US Treasury. That importer then has 3 choices. Absorb the cost, and that means lower profit margins. Pass some of or all of it on to wholesale and retailers, or pass it fully on to consumers. I should add that the importer could also choose to stop the trade altogether, hoping to find alternatives. In practice, most empirical studies of the 2018-2019 tariffs found that much of the cost was borne by US firms and the consumers, not foreign exporters. When tariff revenue rises, that money is overwhelmingly coming out of American pockets. The second point, does the exporting country pay nothing then? Well, not quite. While the tariff is paid domestically, foreign exporters can be indirectly hurt if, 1, US demand falls due to higher prices. They are forced to cut their prices to stay competitive. They lose market share entirely. The burden of the tariff depends on relative bargaining power and supply and demand elasticity. If exporters have many alternative buyers, Americans bear more of the cost. If exporters depend heavily on the US market, they may absorb more of it. With Canada specifically, because supply chains are deeply integrated under agreements like the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the cost often circulates within North America production networks, rather than being clearly an us versus them situation. The third point, are tariffs mainly about stopping imports? Historically, tariffs serve three broad purposes. A, protection. They make imports more expensive so domestic producers can compete. But there's a subtle point here. Often domestic production is not cheaper. It's just made relatively competitive by making imports more expensive. Consumers still pay more overall. B, bargaining leverage. ChatGPT said I was right. Tariffs can function as negotiating tools. Under Trump, tariffs were frequently framed this way, especially in negotiations with China. And point C, countering unfair practices. These practices include subsidies, currency management, intellectual property violations, state-backed industrial policy, often associated with China. This is the standard justification under WTO rules for countervailing duties. The fourth point, are tariffs mainly about revenue? In modern economies like the US, tariffs are not primarily revenue tools. Income taxes and other federal taxes dominate revenue collection. When Trump highlights hundreds of millions raised, that is technically true, but economically it's largely a tax on imports, which mostly lands on domestic firms and consumers. In 19th century America, tariffs were a primary revenue source. Today they are mostly a policy instrument. The fifth point, give me the bigger strategic angle. ChatGPT said there's an additional argument made by some economists and policymakers, which involves importing less. That means reducing strategic dependence on rivals, rebuilding domestic industrial capacity, national security considerations, reshoring supply chains, bringing back onshore supply chains. This became more prominent during the US-China trade conflict and after the pandemic era supply chain disruptions. And the final sixth point, I asked, was I right? Broadly speaking, ChatGPT said I was right, that I correctly understood that 1, tariffs is paid domestically, consumers often bear much of the cost, revenue raised comes mostly from Americans, tariffs are mainly leverage on or protection tools. They are used to counter perceived unfair practices. The only refinement is that the economic burden can be shared. It's not always 100% domestic, but the evidence from recent US tariffs suggests that most of the burden was internal. So, thank you, ChatGPT. That helped a lot. I think I understand it better.